started with Friday meeting, where we get several people involved, whether that's our lovely priests or even the servants of the Friday meeting at St. Mark's. And we basically discuss relevant topics. So just before I carry on, can I ask everyone but Yusuf, Mina, and Abuna to have their microphones muted, just because it will make it easier for the discussion. And Mina, if you've got hosting privileges, if you could also try and mute anyone who doesn't. Thank you. So the topic that we're going to be covering today, if you've seen the advertisement, is the will of God. Okay, and we're going to be looking at it particularly from the book of Jonah, the story of Jonah. And today we've got three people, one of them being duplicates, so you can see Mina twice. But we've got Mina Zaki, who's one of the youth meeting servants. We've got myself as well, Yusuf, one of the youth meeting servants. And today we're very lucky to have with us a guest speaker, and that is Abuna Anthony, our newest priest in St. Mark's, and we're very blessed to have him with us. So hi guys, how are you guys doing?
Very good, thank God. Thank you, Yusuf, for asking. For those of you that don't know, my wife is pregnant and we're expecting a child any day. So if I have to leave this round table last minute, that will be why.
Yeah, but may God hold it off for at least an hour, and then you're free to go.
Amen.
Amen. Yeah, I'm well, thank you, Yusuf. Thanks for asking. And I would like to say that Abuna Anthony is not a guest on the Friday meeting. Abuna Anthony was before and still is Abuna for the Friday meeting. Thank you, Abuna.
That's true. Thank you for the correction, Mina. So as I was saying, the topic for today is God's will in our life, particularly relevant with regards to the fasting that we've just had, the fast of Jonah, and we celebrated his feast day yesterday. And the question that I'd like to open up to both of you is, what is God's will? You know, what does it mean when we use that term? I'm going to, start out open, start out broad, because I'd like to hear your input on that. And please,
you can start us off.
Egyptian stuff.
Then I'll tell you what we think afterwards.
Sure. Thank you for asking the question, Yusuf. I think if we have a clear answer for this, that would have been as if we won the lottery. Because it's the question that each of us would be asking every day in our lives. What's the will of God? Or what's the will of God in my life? But what we can say, if we're asking the question generally, what's the will of God? The will of God is for everyone to be saved. So if I want to speak broadly about what's the will of God in my life, the will of God in my life is for me to be saved and for me to be with him in heaven. That generally speaking. As we can see in St. Paul, in many of his epistles, he's saying the will of God is your sanctification, or the will of God is that you be in prayer and being thankful and being joyful. This is the will of God. And this is what God has created us for, to enjoy his presence and to be reunited back with him in heaven.
Every day.
Sorry, anyone asking a question? No? All right. But if we're talking about the will of God in my life in specific situations, that's a very different question. And to answer that, this is going to be, I think, a different kind of discussion, because for us to know what God is willing in my life in these different situations, there are lots of things we need to go through first. And I'm sure that we may talk about this later into discussion. So I will leave this for Abuna to answer first, and then we can return back to it.
All right. And Abuna, feel free to call out Mina on any heresies. And if you want to excommunicate on the spot, that's cool too.
Yeah, no, of course. So I think Mina jumped the gun a little bit because he was saying what God's will is for us after our fall, but we can take it even one step before that. That God actually created mankind. He created Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden because of his great love, and he had so much love that he created us so that he can love us. And then, of course, he would then want us to love him. Like you love, and then to have a relationship with somebody, that relationship is mutual. Not that he needed our love at all, or it made any difference really to his character, but because of his love, when you love somebody. It's all right. I've got an echo. That's fine. So when we love somebody, two people who love each other will love each other regardless. And so God's will for us was to live in paradise, in the Garden of Eden, in his presence, in his kingdom, with him, in union and communion with him forever. And then, like Mina said, obviously after Adam and Eve chose to eat of the fruit, then his will for us was to restore us to that union that we had lost ourselves in the Garden of Eden. And so everything that happens after that is the story of salvation, like, all the prophets of the Old Testament, Jesus' incarnation, his life, and then his death, his crucifixion on the cross, and then his resurrection is all to restore our relationship with God so that we are united with him. And then, of course, we'll continue that relationship for all eternity. That is his will for us.
So it sounds like there's two levels then. There's the sort of higher overarching will of God, which is, as both of you have said, for our union with him, to be sanctified and to grow more and more in his likeness, which to me sounds like that never changes. It doesn't matter what the circumstance of the timeline or the period is or who you are, that's applicable to everyone. And then I think, as Mina broached, there was the bigger question, which some of us feel might be more difficult to understand, is his specific will for an individual. And we can get deeper into that, but I think now would be a good time to bring in the story of Jonah as a case study, and then what I'll do is I'll ask you some questions around that. But if you'll bear with me, I want to pretty much just say the first verse of Jonah, and then get your thoughts on it. So in Jonah 1:1, for those of you who don't know, Jonah is the story of the prophet who was swallowed by a large fish, and eventually spoke to the people of Nineveh and asked for them to repent. But the story starts out like this. It says, "The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me." But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for that port. And after paying the fare, he went abroad and sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord. So just taking this context, taking the beginning of this, we know that God has a general will for everyone to be saved and to be united with him. And in this story, his will was for the people of Nineveh to be saved. But his specific will for Jonah was for him as the prophet to go speak to him. And Jonah's response was to basically go the other way. So I guess my question is, from this story, how does God's specific will compare to our own will? And how do we sort of reconcile those two feelings? Because I know in our life we've all got sort of things that we want to do. We've got ambitions and goals and whatnot. But specifically in this story, how does Jonah's response to God will serve as a template for either a good response or a bad response? Like, how did you feel when you first read that story?
All right, so let me try to always respond and Abuna to correct me at the end. Thank you, Abuna.
Sure.
So again, it will bring us back to the very, very beginning, and we will find a very similar situation when God has told Adam and Eve, eat from all the fruits from all of the trees except from the one tree. And this was the will of God in their lives.
Mhm.
But when Adam and Eve decided that they want to have their own will, they decided, I want to do this by myself. God has told me this, but I want to do this instead. They went opposite to what God has asked them. And this was pretty much the fall. That when I am doing something against what God has asked me to do, I am disconnecting myself from God. And this was the fall. When Jesus came, he came to reconnect these two wills back again, my will and God's will. And we can see this very clearly, for example, in the Garden of Gethsemane, when he said, Father, please let this cup pass away from me, but it will be according to your will, not my will. Straight away, he said, this is your will. I will do your will, not my will. And this is the purpose, to reconnect these two wills back again. So obviously what Jonah has done is he went the opposite of what God has asked him. And we can see throughout the whole story is that he tried to disconnect himself from God. And again, as per the story of salvation, God chased him to return him back. And as the story of our all salvation, Christ came to return us back to him, to reunite the two wills together. Abuna.
No, I agree with everything you said, Mina. It's great. There's always going to be a tension between my will and God's will if they differ.
Mhm.
And I'll explain what I mean. So for example, so Mina was bringing back again the example of the fall with Adam and Eve when they ate of the fruit of the tree, because essentially the issue was that they were tempted by Satan. Satan said, eat from this tree and then you will be like God. That's what he said. He said, you'll be able to know good and evil. You'll be like God. Eat from this tree. Now, God made his will clear to them. He said, you have the whole of the Garden of Eden. You have the whole of paradise. It's all yours to enjoy. Just do not eat from this fruit. That was God's will. That was his will, his message, his command. Everything I have is yours. We are in union and we have a deep relationship. Just don't eat from this tree. And this is having made mankind in his image and according to his likeness. So already Adam and Eve were made in God's image. And then comes the temptation to eat from the tree. The promise, the lie was to be like God. And so Adam and Eve then ate of the tree because they wanted to be like God. They could see that God was good, and it was very good to be like God, but without God. They wanted to be like God, but without God. So the promise was you can be like God. Well, why should I be like God if I have God and I'm in union and communion with God and I'm abiding in Him and He's abiding in me? But the lie or the temptation that they fell in was to be like Him, but without God being in the picture. And so God didn't necessarily explain that to them. He didn't say, don't eat of this fruit because this is the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and therefore, you're kicking me out of your lives, etc., etc. Not at all. So he revealed maybe part of his will to them. He said, I do not want you to eat, but maybe not the reasoning or the logic. And it didn't make sense in their minds. They thought, well, it's good to be like God. Why not? We all want to be like God. God is great. It's the best thing. I want to be a God. Going back to the story of Jonah, again, God didn't necessarily explain his whole will to Jonah. He just told him, Jonah, I want you to go and preach to the Ninevites. And we know from the story of Jonah, we know that Jonah knows God's character very well. Later on, he's complaining. He said, God, I know that you are good and compassionate and loving and kind. I knew you would forgive them. That's why I didn't want to go in the first place. So he knows God very well. But again, Jonah is stuck in this issue that he is the first prophet that God has ever asked to preach repentance to who's not from the Israelites, not from the tribe of Israel. All the other prophets who were sent before him were to preach to the Jews and tell them, look, return back to God, repent, go turn towards God, pray to God, build up your relationship. So already there was this issue that, to have a relationship with God, you had to be a Jew or an Israelite or from the people, from the tribe of God. So again, it doesn't make sense. Why is God asking Jonah to go and preach to the Ninevites, who are very clearly and obviously against God and have been? And even there were other prophecies said before that, Prophet Nahum said that God's going to destroy Nineveh. So he already knows the prophecy, God is going to destroy them because they are an evil nation and an evil generation. And so it doesn't make sense. And so Jonah was struggling because he knew part of God's will, that God is wanting him to preach, but maybe God didn't explain his whole will to Jonah, in that the bigger picture for God is that every man is to be saved. Every man and woman is to have a personal relationship with God. And salvation is for all of mankind, not just for the people of Israel. And he was stuck in that fact that all he knew was salvation was of the Jews. That's what they believed. That's what they taught. That's what they preached. That's what they preserved so much over the generations, over the years. Do not marry from outside the Jewish people. Do not go into Jewish towns and villages. You will be exiled outside of the promised land, but you will come back to the promised land. It was all about that nation. And God was, in a way, telling Jonah, look, salvation is for all of mankind, but not making it very clear to him or explicit to him.
Yeah.
And we sometimes get the same picture. We get sometimes part of God's will, but not the whole thing explained to us. And that's where we struggle, because our will, as we said earlier, is not always aligned with God's will or in tune with God's will.
I think that's a really interesting point that you brought up. That really resonates, at least with me and probably a lot of people, even now in the 21st century. Like, one of the big stumbling blocks for Jonah was that he didn't have the complete picture, or that perhaps what he was being asked didn't make sense. And that's a stumbling block for a lot of us when we're trying to follow God's will. Like, I found that it's very easy to try and follow God when things make sense, or when there's a logical sort of progression. God, you want me to do this so I can achieve this status, so I can serve you in this way. But the moment that God asks us to do something that we can't fathom or can't understand is the moment we're being asked to relinquish control. And in my view, I think that's probably the hardest thing about following God's will. It's the fact that we don't understand it completely. We don't understand it fully. So we have like the overarching idea of, yes, God wants us to be saved and to be sanctified. But when it comes to us specifically, if God's asking me to do something in a particular way, and I'm like, what? That doesn't make sense. Like, where did that come from? I think that surrender is probably the hardest part in following him. Because it's a control thing. Like, I need to have a sense of control. I will do what I understand, but the moment you ask me to do something I don't understand, I'll look at you funny. And we do it all the time. Like, we'll never believe someone on the street that says you need to do this, or yeah, it's like those ads on the internet where it's like, do this one trick and you'll lose 5 kilograms. Like, well, that's foolish. But it almost seems like whenever God speaks to us, sometimes it's like that. It's like, I want you to do this crazy thing and you'll see the rewards. And it's just an element of trust there. I don't know if that's something you guys ever experienced or agree might have gone through Jonah's head.
Yeah, I think absolutely. And we see this, Yusuf, I think, in many of the characters in the Bible throughout. Like, if you look, for example, at St. Paul's life at the very beginning, if God has told them from the very beginning, you're going to be stoned, you're going to go this and there, they're going to hate you, you're going to go through shipwreck. And then at the very end, you're going to be beheaded for me and all of this. I think if he told him, now I want you to be my apostle, St. Paul will say, oh, definitely not. Same with Moses in the Old Testament. If he told him, oh, you're going to go to Egypt, you have to go through 10 plagues, and then you're going to be trapped into the desert 40 years, going around and around. Nope, not me. It's not going to happen. So I think it's from the mercy and love of God that he doesn't reveal everything in one go for us. Because not that he doesn't want to tell us. He wants to tell us, but we wouldn't understand it. We wouldn't fully accept what God's will in our lives is. Because in many other situations, like at the very beginning with Abraham, we've seen God saying, how can I hide from Abraham what I'm going to be doing? And this is a clear verse. So it's God's heart to reveal to us things, but will we be able to accept it and comprehend it fully? Someone like Abraham, when God told him, go sacrifice your son, he was able to take it. That's why this is the relationship between these two. For us, if God is telling me you're going to go through this problem, no, that's it for me, please. Thank you very much. No, Habibi, you have to go through this to get across and do this after that. Nope, I don't want this. I will be okay without it. And that's the conception that we have. I will be okay without it. Other saints, give it to me. Thank you very much. Anything from your hands to get through, to come to you at the very end.
Yeah.
And that's the difference in mentality.
And just to add on to that, actually, what you were saying, it's funny because I think sometimes we spend so much time thinking about what God's will is for me that we neglect the fact that God uses us in other people's lives. Like if we're being told, if God wants us to do something, it's always in the context of what does that benefit me or my life? God, maybe someone will somehow get a message from God telling them that they need to take this other job, which doesn't quite meet certain characteristics, isn't as high paying or whatever. And we'll say, how could this possibly be making sense in my life? But perhaps God wants us to enter a specific sphere, not for our own sake, but for the sake of the other. Emma, my sister, was telling me this really interesting story by Father Bishoy Anthony, just to like illustrate how God's will can work sometimes. Father Bishoy is like the managing director of CYC. He's got CYC, and he's got lovely stories, and is a really lovely monk. And he was saying how he was driving on the highway at one point in a country, and he just got really tired. Like he just got so tired. And normally what he does when that happens is he tries to like go off into another town and see if he can find some Coptic person to like give him some tea and maybe a rest. So he went off the road and he ended up in this like ghost town. Like he didn't know anyone there. He didn't like, there was barely no one on the street. And he's like, God, what am I to do? I'm so exhausted. I can't keep driving. And then he saw this sign for like some medical practice. And there was a name that was like sort of Christian, but not quite Christian. So he was like, okay, I'm going to rock up. So he went to the medical practice and the receptionist was like, are you sick? Would you like to see a doctor? And he's like, yes, please. So the doctor calls him in and then he was just open. He's like, look, I'm not really sick. I just want some tea and biscuits. And if you got anywhere to rest, that would be great. And the doctor's like, you didn't come for any other reason? He's like, no, I just need some rest. And he's like, actually, maybe I think God sent you to me. And the priest, Abuna Bishoy, is like, oh, okay, why? Tell me what's going on. And he's like, Abuna, for the last 2 weeks, I've had the sense that I'm going to die. Like, I'm going to die soon. I really feel it. And the priest is like, okay, well, tell me a bit about yourself. And he discovered that this man was in fact Coptic or Christian. And he's like, okay, well, you're Christian. You probably go to mass. You've probably confessed. So it's okay. Die. No problem.
Don't get me my tea first.
Yeah, just like, good luck to you. And then the doctor was like, actually, Abuna, I don't really go to church and I haven't confessed in like 30 to 50 years. And the priest was like, okay, well, I'm here now. Tell me. And the doctor's like, no, never. I'm not going to talk about this. Like, this is not, I haven't spoken to anyone. I'm not going to start now. And the priest is like, why? And then like slowly, the guy opened up and he talked about, I did this and that. And then Abuna was like, do you feel bad about it? He's like, yeah, of course I feel bad about it. And then by the end of like this 20-30 minute conversation, Abuna was like, okay, well, confession over. And the doctor's like, what? He's like, yeah, well, you've told me everything and I'm a priest, so I'll just pray the absolution and you're good to go. So he's like, okay, wow, that's amazing. So Abuna prayed the absolution. The doctor was so happy. And he's like, Abuna, I wasn't even meant to come in today. It wasn't even my shift, but I really felt God pushing me to come. So again, you can see how this all started. And Abuna's response was like, I wasn't even meant to be here today as well. I just got tired on the highway. So anyways, they said their goodbyes. Abuna had his biscuit, and afterwards he felt really like awake. I think in his mind, actually, he felt like God had lifted up the slumber. It was almost his sort of doing. So they part their ways, and then 2 months later, he actually meets this doctor's son, who I think he knew through some other means. He's like, oh, how's your dad doing? So-and-so. He's like, I saw him on this day and such. He's like, oh, you saw him? He's like, yeah, how is he? He's like, the day after you saw him, he came to church. He came to church for the first time in years, and he had communion, and he was so happy, and his face was smiling. And then 3-4 days later, he passed away. And the priest was like, what? He's like, yeah. And then he told the son, did you know that I took your father's confession? He's like, no, actually, this was something our family was so worried about. I'm so glad to hear that you took his confession. And then Abuna Bishoy was saying, like, just look at how God like intervenes, even without us knowing or understanding. Like, it's not like he had received a message from God on the highway saying, I need you to find. No, he just made him tired. He actually put him in a difficult situation as the driver so that he could be placed in a room with another man who also wasn't meant to be there, and put him in that conversation so that he could have confession and communion and like be ready to receive like everlasting life. Like God's ultimate will was for this doctor to be saved, and he used Abuna Bishoy, and that had nothing to do with Abuna Bishoy. I mean, I'm sure Abuna Bishoy learned a lesson there, and there was something positive. But my point is, like, sometimes we're asking, what is God's will for me? And sometimes his will isn't just about me. His will is, how can he use me? And I think he did the same with Jonah, even though Jonah didn't quite see it. Eventually he got it. But I just thought I'd share that story because we get so hooked up on God's will and like, God, what job am I going to do for me? How is this going to eventually lead me to this like image of goodness and nice house and nice family and maybe a swimming pool? When in reality, I think we're in a much larger ecosystem. God wants to use us in different ways. And I found that story very encouraging.
That's a lovely story. Thank you, Yusuf. And, if we take that back to Jonah's story, I think Jonah really struggled with processing or understanding God's mercy and his justice. I think he was focused a lot on God's justice. And then, he wanted to take justice in his own hands. He was like, well, I don't think the Ninevites deserve to be saved. So I'm not going to go and preach to them, like you said, because who knows, God forbid, you might actually forgive them. So I don't think they're worthy of it, so I'm not going to go. And he couldn't reconcile God's mercy and God's justice together. And as you said with that story about Bunub Shoy Lantuni, actually, we're not here to understand God's mercy and God's justice. We know and we have faith and we trust in his mercy and his justice. And we believe that they're both perfect and they're both complete. But how is not up to us to understand. Like we know that his mercy is there for every person to be saved. And by any means and by whatever means, like all the means necessary are there. And then his justice, again, we do not understand, but he is a fair and he is a just God. And as you said with that example with Abuna Bishoy, it was God's will for that person to be saved. And through Abuna Bishoy. And that's the struggle, I think, with, if we so and he used the Abuna Bishoy in that example because maybe Abuna Bishoy already has his will aligned to God's will. Like he's already submitting his will to God. It doesn't actually matter what he wants and whether God provides it or not, he is satisfied regardless. So he wanted rest. He didn't get rest, but he was still satisfied. In fact, he had probably a man complaining to him for a long time and saying, this is the last thing I need because I'm tired. So he didn't get his rest. But because he had submitted his will to God's will already, then that was enough to lift up his spirits and to help him go along his journey.
Let me ask a practical question then. So if we take it from this, I've reached a stage now in my relationship where I want my will to align with God's. How, A, practically, how do we do that? And B, how can I hear his will, or do I even need to hear his will? Like, is that a necessity? Because I know a lot of us in this chat, a lot of us listening now, we always come across this dilemma of, I've got a big decision in my life. I really want God's input. How do we incorporate God into these decisions? And B, how do we hear his response, or do we need to hear one?
All right, so I think it's all of us. We all have the same question. Lord, what do you want me to do? Or what's your will in this situation? Or I have this interview. Shall I take the job? Shall I not take the job? Or university, shall I go to this course or this course, and so on? And we stand in front of God and ask him, and many times we don't hear a response. Is it because God doesn't want to tell us? I highly doubt that. I think it's always us not hearing well. And why don't we hear well? Because God is not the genie in the box. He's not, I'm not Aladdin rubbing the lamp. Genie, God, what shall I do now? Yes, do this. Oh, thank you. Bye. Good night. This is not how it works. We think that this is how it works. And definitely this is not how it works. How will it work? It works when I have a relationship with God. So this is a whole system. When everything is tuned according to God's will, then when I have a situation and I need to hear God's voice, that's when I'm going to hear his voice, because he wants to tell me. But that will happen when I have clear ears listening to God's voice. I cannot be watching TV the whole day, listening to different musics the whole day, playing around the whole day, and then bam, God, tell me, what do you want me to do? Yes, this is what I want you to do. It's not going to happen this way. But when my heart is tuned to God the whole day, I am praying, I'm reading my Bible, I'm going to church, my whole system, everything around me is tuned according to God's will. And then, because I have this relationship with him, when I'm going to ask him, he's going to reveal his will in my life. So, for example, I read my Bible, and the Bible is telling me, love your enemies. And I am having a huge fight with my friend. So, and then I start asking God, what do you want me to do? Habibi, I want you first to love your enemies, and then I will start revealing to you the next steps. Or I am not praying, or I'm not feeling joyful, or I'm not any of these many commandments that we see throughout the Bible. And we instantly feel that God is talking to me. Oh, I'm back home from work, and oh, let me just stretch my legs and watch some TV. Habibi, go up to pray. Read the Bible. No, I'm tired. What's God's will in this situation? For me to get up and pray. Have I prayed first? No. Have I repented first? No. Have I done his will in everything I have read? No. Then how come will I just tell me and he's going to tell me? It doesn't work like that. Kabuna.
Yeah, thank you, Mina. And thank you for that answer. So just going back to hearing God's voice, because there are times when we can hear his voice. And like you said, actually, Jesus is the shepherd. And he said in the example of the good shepherd, I am the shepherd, and my sheep know me. They recognize my voice, they hear me, and they know me. But that requires a relationship. I think what you're trying to say is the relationship, to know somebody requires effort, requires work, and requires to know. And it's only when you have a relationship with somebody that close that you will then be able to discern or recognize or hear a voice. You know, if there was a sheep that was not of the shepherd's flock and just wandered in and wandered out, they would not have recognized the voice of the shepherd because they didn't have that relationship. Liken it, for example, to a marriage relationship. You know, two people who are just getting to know each other, yeah, they're discovering each other, and they won't necessarily know a lot of things about the other person. But take somebody who's been married to somebody for 30 or 40 years. They can just give them a look and they'll say, I know exactly what you're thinking. Or they'll say, I know exactly what's going through your mind. Because they've had that relationship, that closeness, that bond. And they'll know that they'll communicate with each other in so many different ways, not just spoken, but spoken. You know, they can give them a look, they can do something, they can, the way that they act or the way that they move, their partner, their spouse, their wife or their husband will know exactly what they mean or what's going through their minds because of that closeness, that relationship that's developed over the years. The question I think that we really ought to be asking is, do we trust him? Do we trust God? Because, yeah, I agree. A lot of us probably are on this meeting today looking for that golden answer. How do I discern God's will for my life in A, in B, in X, or in Y? And yes, we've been talking now for a good half an hour, 45 minutes about, well, we need to have a close relationship with him to get to know him. And then once we build that relationship, hopefully we'll then be able to have that trust to do whatever it is that he asks of us. I'll give you an example. So if I don't know, you know, I'd like to be married and I don't know who to marry. I'd like God to tell me, you know, which spouse I should be looking for or to approach, etc. The first thing that we should ask, or the way that we should ask in this particular context or this situation, and the same for any question, is rather, you know, rather than asking God because I want God to please me, I want him to fulfill for me this desire, I want him to give me an answer, I should reverse it. I should be asking God, what is it, Lord, that I can do to please you? Not what can you do to please me? You know, which, you know, if I'm a man looking to get married, which woman will make me happy as my wife that I can ask? No, Lord, what can I do to please you? And then the genuine answer to that question will be rooted in a relationship with him. You know, actually, what I can do to please him is to be in communion with him through the sacraments of the church, through my personal time with him, through my prayer, through my Bible. And yes, and that can result in a relationship, which is a godly relationship, which can end in, you know, a marriage and result in a life of marriage. But I'm approaching this decision a different way, rather than, God, what is it that I want and can you fulfill it? No, it's what is it that you want from me and how can I fulfill that? Because at the end of the day, all these decisions have an impact on our salvation. Like if we again use the example of marriage, like what is the point of marriage? Yeah, marriage is to be sanctified and for the salvation of both. And we say that a marriage mimics or mirrors the Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, or man, wife, and God. So yes, it's important, and God will care about it. But if I am approaching it from a deep-rooted relationship with God, because if I don't trust him in other things in my life, then why would I necessarily expect an answer for him for these things? Because I'm not seeking after that relationship, that deep relationship with him to start with. Somebody explains it in a really good way. He said that there's the general will of God, which is like a big circle, and then within that there is a smaller circle, which is God's personal will for me, like my personal life, like these decisions, like career, like marriage, like whatever it is. And we come to God asking him for my personal will. What is your will for my personal life, without entering this bigger circle of God's general will for me, which is to be in communion with him, to have a relationship with him. And we won't get an answer. Of course we won't. Like we don't have that closeness to be able to hear his voice or to discern his will. And it's only through spending time with him do we have an ear that is more sensitive to his voice.
And actually, to add on to that, I feel like the pressure of hearing his will is a lot more when all you're doing is focusing on the smaller circle. Like if you're spending your whole time thinking, oh, what's the career, what's the thing that will work, or what's the marriage that will work? From what I've seen, and even just in my own personal experience, when you're so invested in the general will of God, in building that relationship, that communion, and that trust, there is a level of peace to be had with these other decisions. Because what you ultimately realize is whether you pick the right thing or not, or whether your hearing is clear or not, the intention is there for you to be in God's, be in union with God, and God sorts it out. He really does. He sorts out the mistakes. He sorts out the absolute worst things that can happen, and he gives you a peace there because you're still in that general will. I think the moment you try and take that specific will out and you're not in sort of God's comfort or in his peace or under sort of his shadow, then you're under a lot of pressure because you're like, I need to get this right because I'm putting so much security and hope in something that is so temporal. Well, not temporal necessarily, like marriage is eternal, but say it's a career or whatever that is so temporal that I feel like if this doesn't work out, I've got nothing else. Whereas I suppose you could argue, a really experienced, mature Christian will say, even if this does not work out, I still have my Lord. And that gives you a lot of security and comfort.
I think that brings us to another point, Yusuf, is that sometimes we approach God asking what's his will with a predetermined mind of our own. So, Lord, I want this job. And I'm going in prayer. Do you want me to take this job or not? But I really want this job. And then when I don't pass the interview, I get really upset and really frustrated. And why didn't you get me this job, Habibi? Didn't you just ask me if I want you to have it or not? I have done my will in your life. Will you accept it? No, but I really wanted the job. So many times we approach God like with predetermined decisions on our own without asking, Lord, what do you see for our lives? And as Abuna was saying exactly, like I approach God for my sake rather than, Lord, what is it that you want me to do? What will I do to glorify your name? It doesn't really matter this job or this job as long as I will be in communion with you to glorify you. And that should be the mindset to approach him.
Can I ask you a follow-on question then, Mina, for both of you, Mina and Yusuf? Is it therefore wrong to want things or to have your own desire? Say, you genuinely wanted one job over the other, you're genuinely putting it in front of God. Is it wrong to want something? What about our own desire? What about our own wishes? Does God care about those things?
Yusuf?
Mina. Okay, I'll start. Absolutely not. It's not wrong. I think it'd be silly to say that it's wrong, and it'd be silly to neglect how we feel about things because it stems from something. I don't know. The way I've always sort of viewed it is that there's something that we wish for that underpins all our desires. Why do I want a specific job? Is it because I want the security? Is it because I want to excel in something and be able to use a gift or a talent or whatever it is? And those desires are important. Like if you don't have those desires, there's something perhaps innately wrong with you. But the question is, do I have to pin all my desires and hopes onto one thing, thinking that my gamble on this job, my gamble on this situation is going to be the perfect thing? I think that's where things need to really be checked into place. Because ultimately, what we're asking or what we're saying when we're looking for God's will, if done right, is, Lord, I'm humble enough to realize that I've got a very limited mind, and I just want you to provide like the optimal route. And of course, if God says this isn't the optimal route, when you've put all your hedges, like when you've hedged all your bets onto something, that does hurt. Because you're like, but it's so obvious, God. Like, how could this not be the job? Or how could this not be the girl? Or guy, if you're a girl. But at the end of the day, God has a much bigger picture, like a much bigger picture. And, that bigger picture includes miraculous things like parting of the Red Sea and people being resurrected. And I don't think he wants to stop us from experiencing that either. So I absolutely see no problem with us being upset or with us having desires. It's what makes us human, and it's what God has put into us. But as part of the spiritual journey, I really think that following God's will is as much about submitting to him as it is about the actual thing on the other side of his will. Like, he values our submission and our obedience more than perhaps the job that we get in the end. That's my view. I don't know.
Yeah, I agree. I agree, Abuna, with what Yusuf was saying, is that God wouldn't, like, it's not wrong for me to want something. And I should pray about it, of course. But at the end of the day, how much my heart is sensitive towards this thing, because the verse is very clear. Seek first the kingdom of God, and all of these things will be given to you in abundance. If I lost this job, or if I lost this girl, or if I lost this thing that I was praying for, will I cut my relationship with God totally and say, oh, you disappointed me, I don't want you again in my life? Then definitely this is wrong. But if I prayed about it, and Lord, this is really something I want, and it's on my heart, but God has closed the door for it, will I be upset from God, or will I accept his will in my life? And also, the other thing is, what is it that I'm praying for? Like, for example, if I'm really keen to be, as Yusuf was saying earlier, I'm praying and praying and praying, and really I want this position in my company. I want to be the CEO in my company. Why am I praying for this? Am I actually wanting this for the glory of God, or is it just a selfish desire? Because again, it depends on what is it that I'm praying for. It could be purely selfish desire. I want to be the CEO. I want the position. I want the bigger salary. I want this, and that. And all of these are not in accordance to what you said earlier, the bigger circle of God's will, the general big circle of God's will. But for example, if I don't think God would mind whether I'm a doctor or an engineer. It's not like God would be upset, oh, I wanted you to be an engineer and you disobeyed me and you became a doctor. I don't think at all. God will honor my decision in that phase, and he will use me in whatever I pick, because we still have free will, and God honors our free will, and he appreciates that we have our free will and decisions to take. So he will honor this, and he will bless my route, and he will bless my path to come closer to him, and he will use me to glorify his name, as long as I'm submitting everything that I'm choosing and desiring for his glory.
And can I just say, actually, it's okay if we don't go down the optimal path, as the story of Jonah has proven time and time again every year. Jonah very purposefully went against God's will, and then there was consequences, and he ended up in a whale. And nonetheless, like, God's ultimate plan was fulfilled, and Jonah learned a lesson. And that's part of the spiritual life as well. I know we tend to get hooked up really highly on what is God's will for me, and if I don't get the will right this time round, that's it, it's game over. But God doesn't operate that way. And if anything, life is nothing like that. We'll never get it right 100% of the time. We'll never be able to hear him correctly 100% of the time. But the important thing is that we can adapt and learn and grow. And as you say, Mina, if things don't go the right way, to still seek him. And to be honest, if we do that, I think we're okay. There will definitely be dark moments. There's no denying that. And there will be consequences that we definitely don't want. God doesn't want us to suffer or go through difficult things, but at the same time, in those moments of difficulty, whether that's self-induced because we go against his will, or if God allows for things to happen so that we can learn, there's growth to be found, because ultimately it's about eternity. It's not about the here and now, it's about the future and eternal living with God. And sometimes we forget that.
I fully agree with that, Yusuf. And I think as well that if we feel that we made a mistake or we could have made a mistake, the only thing we need to do is, Lord, please correct my messing up, because we always will keep on messing up. I think I messed up plenty of times, and the only thing I can do is, Lord, I messed up, please correct my mistakes. And he's more than faithful and more compassionate and loving and merciful to keep on correcting our mistakes. Like, I think Moses messed up big time. 40 years, it took God 40 years to correct his mistake, but again, he returned him back to the plan that he had for him to be the leader and to get the Israelites out. So it might take a little bit of covering our mistakes, but he will at the end correct our mistakes and use us back to the path and to the will to work with him and to bring glory to his name, as he have seen and set for us. As the verse said, that we are all God's
Workmanship.
Yes, doing his in English, because sorry.
I don't remember the rest of the verse, but I know what you're saying.
It's all right. أعمال صالحة قد سبق الله أعدها لكي نسلك فيها. I'm so sorry.
You're such an encyclopedia of verses. We'll try and get a translation.
It's all right.
But in the meantime, if it's okay with you, just because I'm conscious of time as well, Abun, I'm going to pick on you, and feel free to share as much as you're willing to. But you've obviously had a very big sort of a life change recently, going from layperson to clergy. And of course, there was a process there of trying to discern, is this God's will for me? And the implications of your decision aren't just you or your family, but for an entire congregation. Would you be able to sort of share with us how you tried to discern God's will in that, and what you did practically for trying to engage God in that decision?
Sure. So I think there had been a particular call for me to the priesthood for a number of years. It wasn't just in the last year or two that I was asked. I was asked before then. And then there was a level of resistance that I had, I guess. I thought naturally at the time, maybe I was younger, maybe I wasn't mature enough, maybe it wasn't the right time. What about my future? What about my career? All these questions start going through your mind, as they would logically. You have yourself a plan and a path that you're following, and that makes sense. And seemingly God has blessed that plan, because things were going all right. I didn't have no problems in my work. I was progressing well. So what is going on here with this other thing that's come up? What is going on? So for a while, ever since the first time I was called, I was quite resistant to it, and said no. Maybe like Jonah, if you want, Jonah said no. And why was that? And I think for me, it was because I had control. That gave me a sense of control. I could choose, and choosing no was, for me, I felt like that was the right thing, the logical thing, etc. And then, so I thought maybe I could accept this calling to the priesthood, but on my own terms, at the right time, etc. Much later on in life, maybe when I'm retired, had a family, raised the kids, etc. Whatever it is that I had in my mind, it'll be on my terms. And then somebody very close to me, my wife, said to me in a conversation, well, if this is God's will for us, if neither of us know if it is or not, if this is God's will for us, that I be ordained a priest, I accept this calling, then who are we to say no? Who are we to say no to God's calling? We don't know, but so that for me was the change in my mind. I was thinking, well, I'm making this decision because it's affecting me and my life and my family and those around me. My decision is no, because that makes sense to me, and that's what I've decided. But then what Joey was saying to me, my wife, she was saying, well, who are we to say no? Made me rethink and reevaluate and say, actually, rather than what I was saying earlier, rather than God, this is what I want to make me happy, is that okay? But rather, God, is this what you want, and will this make you happy? And from that moment on, when I had that switch in my mind, and obviously, we spoke about it a lot as a family, we prayed about it, we sought spiritual guidance. Something that's very important for all of us is to seek spiritual guidance from spiritual guides, whatever decision it is that we are facing. I then had a sense of peace about it, not because I have any logical answers to all these concerns that I had. All the same situation was as it was. All the things that concerned me before that made me say no were still there. None of them got answered. There are no solutions about security financially, and family life, and how it's going to affect relationships and going out, and all those questions that hang over a decision like this. They remained unanswered. I didn't have answers for them, but there was a sense of peace that, okay, God, well, if this is what you want for me, then you're going to look after me. It's as simple as that. There's a nice part in the Gregorian liturgy after the story of salvation, when the priest is praying, and he's praying the whole story of the salvation. After that, during the institution of the narrative, the first lines, I offer you, O my master, the symbols of my freedom. I offer you, O my master, the symbols of my freedom. And it comes down to what we were talking about in the discussion earlier. If Jesus died for me on the cross, what more is there that he can do for me? There is nothing. He has offered me his everything. So then who am I to want these things, or to have my own desires and my own will, etc.? I just offer it all to him. And according to the priesthood is not for everybody. It's not that everybody who feels this way will then go into the church and say, can I be a priest? That's not the way it is. But that was God's calling for me. That was very specific to me. And he has his reasons for that. And I'm still discovering those reasons now. It might well be, a lot of priests that I've spoken to who have also been called in their young age and in the middle of successful careers and things like that, a real curveball in their life, for example. And I think this completely applies to me as well. They say, God called me to the priesthood for my salvation, to save me. That was his reason. And it applies. It's for my salvation, first and foremost. Before I think of anybody else's salvation, it was for me. He's working in my life for me, to save me. That's what he wants for each and every one of us, to save us. And for each and every one of us, he's calling us to something. For me, it was the priesthood. For you, it might be something else. It might be a career that's going on. It might be a relationship, a marriage, whatever it is. He's calling each and every one of us to something for our salvation. But it was only when I, through the help of my wife, when I switched from, no, I'm going to make my decisions because it puts me in control and it makes sense to me. When I switched from that mentality to the mindset of, actually, what is it, God, that you want me to do in my life to please you? Use me for your glory, whatever it is that you will for me to do. That the decision then became clear in my mind as to what to do. And then I accepted the call, if that makes sense.
That's really beautiful, Abuna. I think if we relate this to Jonah and to our lives, it's going to be quite similar. Because if we think about it, out of all the prophets, God has chosen Jonah, probably the one prophet who wouldn't have gone to Nineveh when being asked by God. And we pretty much at the very beginning wondered why didn't you choose any other prophet that would just obey you and go? And it's because of Jonah's heart that didn't accept that God could forgive other people and want other people's salvation other than the Israelites. And when Jonah said no, God told him, no, Habibi, you're going. I will send you the whale. I will take you to Nineveh. And you need to understand to love them. And when the story ended in chapter 3, we find that there is still chapter 4, which again didn't make sense at the very beginning. Why is there chapter 4? He went, he preached there, they repented, you accepted them. But why was chapter 4? And chapter 4 was just for Jonah to know that God is merciful and accepting everyone. So Jonah would get this for his own. And as Abuna, you're saying, I think many times it could be, as we discussed earlier, it could be for other people, but it could be for us as well. The stuff that God asks us to go through, it could be for us as well. Thank you for sharing this, Abuna. It's really beautiful.
Not at all. Not at all. I think that like a big step for me was fear, that element of fear of losing control. And understandably so, because if genuinely we are going to say, okay, God, I submit my will into your hands, then we don't know what's going to happen next. So we need to be careful when we seek God's will, because are we going to be willing to accept his will when he tells us what his will is? That's the difficulty. And of course, like when we put it in the context of salvation, of what he's done for us, yeah, it's very easy. Like sometimes we're a bit harsh on Jonah, but Jonah didn't have the security of Jesus's death on the cross to say, okay, wow, God, you love me that much. You died on the cross for me. We have no excuse. Like we have everything set before us. But Jonah, he was still a prophet of the Old Testament. And yet they were still discovering who God was. Is difficult for mankind to know.
No, I wasn't saying that you did like Jonah at all. Don't get me wrong.
No, don't worry. I'm just trying to give Jonah a bit of a boost.
It's interesting.
Thank you.
No worry, it's not about me. But like, if the prophet Hosea, God's going to tell him you're going to get married. It's like, okay, God, you're going to get married to a prostitute. It's like, okay, God, that's your will for me. Okay, I'll do it. So it's are we ready to? Oh, that's a very extreme example, but are we ready to accept God's will for us in our lives? That's the question.
And it's interesting because the fear is there, and what I'm about to say is much easier said than experienced and done. But like in the Bible, that fear and then the decision to follow God is always followed by a miracle, or it's always followed by something beyond imagination. And sometimes we might lose sight of that with God. Like he is a loving father that only wants the best and only wants to offer everything. There's no punishment to be had on the other side, just pure love. And it's getting over that mental block and saying, I'm going to submit to you, God. I'm going to let loose of that control, but also in the knowledge of who you are as one who is kind and compassionate and loving, and then seeing what happens, basically. But it is much easier said than done. But thank you for sharing your story and sort of your experience, because I think it's an example that probably trumps a lot of other examples in our life in terms of what to consider and how to involve God in our life. But I loved what you said about, who am I to say no to God, and appreciating that perhaps the bigger challenge is not necessarily hearing God, but saying yes to him. We've had a good amount of time sort of discussing this. I'd like to just give some time to open up to people as well to see if they have any questions, comments. So Mina, if you could perhaps stop the live stream, and then we can open up to anyone listening if they have any particular questions. We have a real life priest here, so you've got he may even be able to absolve you on the spot. So please do ask your questions or